Before we begin, a warning. This episode contains descriptions of war and sexual violence. From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. For almost 2 years, a deadly civil war has been raging in Sudan. And yet, it's hardly ever talked about. A few weeks ago, the veteran war correspondent at the Times, Loyd, made his way to the front line.
So this was the first day that I'd actually reached Omdurman. Omdurman being the city, the twin city to Khartoum, and abutting Khartoum just divided by the Nile. And in Omdurman, there's been really heavy fighting, particularly last year throughout the spring and then again in the autumn. So a lot of the city's in ruins. One of the main cemeteries in Omdurman is called the Ahmed Shafi Cemetery. It's one of several, but it's the principal one. And the first day I went there, because you get in a cemetery a very good understanding of not just death toll, but what people are dying of. In the middle of a funeral service for a guy whose nickname was Bundug. He had been a builder and he had been a prisoner. And he had died essentially of malnutrition and he'd been really severely tortured. He'd died 10 days after getting out of prison. And he was being buried. Bundug's body was on this improvised bed platform and the dua, the funeral prayers, were being recited by the lead undertaker, Omdurman.
La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah.
And it was quite a dramatic scene. The sun was going down. There's just graves and graves around. This cemetery's been extended 3 times since the start of the war 2 years ago to cope with the dead. And all around, as they've prepared the grave for Bundug, there are other men digging and picking out the ground to get the ground opened up for more dead people. And you've got these fork-tailed kites wheeling in the sky, these incredible birds that you see in a lot of parts of Africa. The sun's going down, you've got the kind of ruins of the city stretching off eastward towards the Nile. Across the Nile is this kind of sound of irregular artillery kind of bouncing in occasionally. Sporadic, but it was quite a scene. And then at the last minute, this guy walked up with the body of an infant boy who was 2 months old, his son, in his outstretched hands. And he said, "Can I bury my boy?" to the family of Bundug, with Bundug. And they were strangers, they didn't know each other. And the family said yes. And it was just this moment. They lowered Bundug into the grave, this very shallow grave, I noticed too. And then he tucked the body of this little boy against his chest. And then the soil started going in as around and nearby men were digging other graves, and the sound of the artillery and these kites wheeling in the sky. And just this infant buried against the chest of a man who he hadn't known. Strangers in life, companions in death. It really caught me. Yeah, really got me. One of a couple of times in that assignment I found I had sand in my eye.
This war is taking a horrific toll on millions of innocent people, with reports of more than 150,000 dead, 11 million displaced, and evidence of genocidal war crimes. Why has the war in Sudan been overlooked? The story today, on the front line of a forgotten war.
My name is Loyd, and I'm the special correspondent for The Times.
Anthony, this is a war that a lot of people seem to have forgotten. It doesn't get very much coverage. Just describe, when you were there, on, what is effectively the front line. What does that look like and how does it feel?
It's an area of fighting such as I've rarely seen, because it's in Africa and it's on the banks of the Nile. You've got these two cities, Khartoum on the east bank, Omdurman on the west, twin cities. There aren't many cities in the world that have become the scenes of modern battles. There's some in Ukraine, in Gaza too. But these two big cities that have been heavily fought over the last 2 years, particularly Omdurman, so much of the centre of particularly the souk area is total ruins. Some people have returned, but not so many, because the area still gets shelled, and the level of destruction without there having been much rebuilding is such that people don't have much to go back to. So you've got all the destruction and all the absence of humans so common in an urban battlefield.
And how violent is the battle there at the moment?
You wake up every morning and you hear the Sudanese Armed Forces artillery banging out into Khartoum, and you get some of that coming back too. But it goes in fits and starts. I think it's important to remember with any long-term war, and now this war's 2 years old, it ebbs and it flows. The thing about the war in Sudan is it's a very extensive, it's a big-scale, wide-scale war. It's all across the country. Different parts, different elements of war in different areas, west, south, central. The front line is more of a grey zone than a definitive front line of trenches like in, say, Ukraine. So it comes and it goes. I mean, there is a backdrop of daily violence. People are killed every day by shelling, most of them civilian. But in terms of really big wham-bam fighting, that happens when there's a battle, and there were only 2 really big battles last year.
Tell me about some of the people you met living in the middle of this war zone.
There's a lot of things we were able to follow up there as journalists. And I remember particularly in the hospital, the Al Now Hospital, a really dramatic kind of scene. It's the main wartime hospital in Omdurman where most of the wounded are taken. And we go in there, and there's this kid there, there's this girl who's 6 years old called Gaitha. She's been wounded in her left arm and left leg. The previous day, she'd been in the yard of her home in Omdurman, cleaning her teeth, and her brother, his name was Mohammed, he was 9, was playing on his bike beside her. So I found out where they lived and went round there and sent a go-between in to ask the family if they could speak to me, and they wanted to speak to me, as many people did there. And so then I'm confronted by Mohammed's mum, called Salma, who was only about 30, I think. And she described to me, and this was a family who had already been displaced once by fighting somewhere else, so they were living in a house that wasn't theirs. Where was Mohammed when the shell struck? She said, so I'm doing the cooking in the house, and I got 4 of my kids with me, and the other 2, Mohammed and Gaitha, playing outside, Mohammed on his bike, Gaitha cleaning her teeth. And suddenly there's a huge explosion. The shells just landed in the yard, and I run out, and there's Gaitha screaming, "Mummy, mummy, mummy," on the ground. She's wounded and bleeding, and Mohammed, who's been torn apart by the shell. But she said as well, I had my other 4 children with me, so they will see what's happened to that brother. And as she was talking, Mohammed's elder sister, and this was a girl, I think about 13 years old, put 3 photographs of her brother in front of me because she wanted to show me her brother, her dead brother, killed the day before. And the photos of them as a family just before the war. So I see Mohammed sitting there in a little white shirt, and he's got this expression of real kind of childish seriousness on his face, and he's got his sisters beside him and Gaitha beside him, and the mum Salma standing in the back. And we're just looking at the photographs, and this sister is staring at the photographs as well, and she's seeing her brother and noting all those details I've just described. And then suddenly it was like a thunderstrike. You could just suddenly see her brain clicked onto that wasn't what he looked like the last time I saw him, because suddenly she just clapped her hand to her eyes and sobbed and just ran away across the yard sobbing. And I think what I'm trying to say there is 2 things. The carelessness with which the war kills people who are just not only trying to get on with their lives, they're trying to survive hardship and displacement anyway. But also the intimacy which is always there in war, when you get people who are willing to speak to you as a foreign journalist, to describe the horror of what has just happened to them. And that event will affect that family in one way or another for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. And Anne, there's been so little coverage of this war. I feel like we sort of have to go back to first principles. So just roll out the map for us. Just remind us exactly where Sudan is, how big a country it is, and what it is that's being fought over.
So Sudan's a huge country, Africa's third largest country, pre-war population of about 48 million, bordering Egypt, Chad, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the Central African Republic. It's got a bit of coastline, important bit of coastline with the Red Sea. A lot of differences in the way the war is fought in the country between the war in the West, the war in the centre, the war in the South, but really important regionally. And the war is not and will not be confined just to Sudan's borders. A lot of regional players involved, and the conflict has every propensity of being able to spill outside those borders should the situation degrade further than it already has.
And just remind us how this civil war began.
Civil war started in April 2023. Now, people often describe it as a war of two generals. It's partially accurate, but it's a little more complex than that. In April 2023, two erstwhile allies, the commander of the Sudanese armed forces, who's a guy called General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, he fell out over a power-sharing agreement with the commander of the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, called General Mohammed Hamdan Daglo, otherwise known as Hameti. These guys have been allies. They'd cooperated in previous areas of fighting out in Western Sudan. They'd cooperated really in stymieing the hopes for democracy that had briefly kind of floated in Sudan in 2009 to kind of 2021. And they're in a power-sharing agreement. That agreement was stressed by various things, economic factors, squabbles over gold resources. There were tribal dynamics as well between particularly kind of African tribes from northern Sudan and Arab tribes from western Sudan. There were a lot of other things in the background. There were different regional allies of those two groups, the SAF and the RSF. As soon as it started in Khartoum and Omdurman, the war rolled out across the country, and then you get this huge death toll.
And in terms of the impact, I mean, how bad has it been? How big is the death toll?
It's appalling. At the moment, you've got the worst displacement crisis in the world. You've got more than 11 million people displaced internally from their homes by fighting inside Sudan. You've got well over 2 million people who have travelled outside Sudan as refugees to neighbouring countries to escape the fighting. You've got 26 million in need of emergency food aid. You've got 500,000 exposed to a famine, which has been confirmed by the UN out in the west of the country. Then you've got 150,000 dead, at least.
I mean, that's an extraordinary number for a modern war.
It's an extraordinary number, and it's probably much worse than that. Now let's talk about that 150,000, because it's very important to understand death in war. Some of the 150,000 have died violently. They're combatants. Most of them are civilians who've been killed in massacres, in ethnic cleansing, or by shell fire or bullets. Then as well, the next, possibly even the bigger figure than that, is those who have died of malnutrition. Now, we all kind of understand what famine looks like because we've seen pictures. Many of us will have memories of 1984 and the Horn of Africa famine then.
In Ethiopia, 7 million people are threatened by starvation. Thousands have already died. The famine caused by drought is the worst in living memory, and now the rains have failed again for the third year in succession.
And we will think of children with exposed rib cages, with extended bellies, with wide staring eyes, looking extremely emaciated with very dry, brittle hair, all the characteristics of particularly kids suffering in a famine. But that's not what's killing most people in Sudan at the moment. Most people are killed by something which was happening before, and it's far more insidious, and that's acute malnutrition. Before you get a famine declared, you have what Sudan has, which is really widespread malnutrition, people literally not getting enough to eat. It's not as extreme as famine, and they don't look like they're in a famine. They look undernourished and underweight. But what happens is that the very old and the very young start dying of preventable diseases that their bodies cannot fight off. They can't dodge the diseases, and once the diseases set in, then it kills them. So you get a lot of young and a lot of old killed by things like diarrhea or chest infections. As malnutrition gets worse and worse, then the band of those it kills gets wider and wider, so you start getting different age groups dying. wartime malnutrition is directly related to the war. It's due to harvest supplies having been burned, harvest being interrupted by fighting. It's due to starvation being used as a weapon of war by the obstruction of humanitarian supplies going into areas occupied by one side or the other. People may be listening saying, well, okay, that's malnutrition. It'd be quite easy to correct, and it could even be a ceasefire and improvement in harvest. But no, the precursors caused by the damage to existing food supplies and waterways, analysed by really top food security organisations, those analysts have come out with studies which suggest that between 6 and 10 million Sudanese might die between now and 2027, according
6 and 10 million.
They say that 6 million is the optimistic scenario, according to the trends of analysis of the trajectory of the war and its impact on harvest, food routes, and water courses. The worst is yet to come.
Anthony, you've been talking about the war in Sudan, which a lot of people, haven't heard very much about, even though it's been raging for 2 years now. I know you've seen it up close. You went and spoke to some of the people who have suffered, and it's not just the deaths and the malnutrition. There's also a lot of sexual violence. Tell me a bit about a woman you met, Rahaf, and her daughter.
I had heard of a rape of a young woman in a particular community by RSF fighters, and I was following up on that, and people directed me to the family involved. And it was very difficult. The young woman who'd been raped was a teenager. And so as a journalist, I would suggest, not in the first instance speaking to the victim of savage sexual assault. But I had a long conversation with the young woman's mother, first of all, to see if it was a subject she could bear to speak about with me. Can she tell us, as she wishes to tell us, what happened at 11 o'clock?
من الساعة 11 يوم الوقفة ككل السودانيين الناس بتحضر من بدري.
And she, very, very cool woman, I guess in her late 30s, early 40s perhaps, the name she prefers to be known as Rahaf. And she wanted me to know about the rape of her daughter from her perspective as a mother, because her daughter was unable to talk about it. She also said, slightly angrily, people should know what can happen to women here.
Yeah.
So it's the evening before the start of Eid celebrations last year in a community in Western Khartoum. By that stage, everyone's really tired because they've been fasting in Ramadan for a month. And the evening before Eid, the end of Ramadan, the end of fasting, there's also a lot to do. People get their house ready, they get food in for the celebrations the next day. So you're up cleaning the house and getting food in all night long anyway. Rahaf's husband was elsewhere. He married to another woman and he was not living in that community. That was apparent. She's got 4 kids and they're all kind of teens. It's hot. She finally, having cleaned the house with her eldest daughter, who's 17 years old and is known by the name Duria, which is an alias, at their request for protection, go to sleep. And she says to her daughter, who's a sensitive young woman who I did meet, look, why don't you sleep in the corridor with me? Because there's a bit more breeze in the corridor. But Duria chooses to sleep in her room. At some point in the night, 3 RSF fighters force a window in the hours of darkness, get into the house, and they go to Duria's room, and 2 have got knives, one's got a pistol. Duria wakes up with a knife at her throat and a guy's hand on her mouth. At first they say to her, have you got gold? Have you got a phone? A lot of Sudanese families will have gold jewelry. They then rape her. And they leave. The rest of the family are asleep throughout. So Rahaf wakes, still in the hours of darkness, before dawn. She awakes suddenly and her daughter is crouched beside her with a blanket around her shoulders, shaking and mute in shock. So Rahaf says, well, what's happened. And then through the few words her daughter was able to speak, she realized what had happened. Rahaf starts screaming. She says to me, I just couldn't stop screaming. I ran out. She said like a crazy woman screaming. All the neighbors get up. You know, it's a hullabaloo. People rush in. They realize what's happened. And people are furious. Some of the men go off down the road to an RSF base, which is or outpost, which is at the end of the street. And they say to the RSF, some of your guys have broken into a house and they've raped a young woman. And the RSF commanders get involved because it's urban community and this could really engender a spirit of resistance and stir things up. So then you get 2 or 3 senior RSF commanders turn up still before dawn in Rahaf's house, and they question Duria in the presence of her aunt. At some stage, Duria is also examined by a female doctor. The RSF acknowledged that the rape occurred, but challenged whether or not it was their fighters. They suggest it could have been some armed gang. But as Rahaf, the mother, told me, listen, I've lived in that area for years. I know all the young guys here. None of them are going to break into my house with daggers and pistols and rape my daughter. It's the RSF. You know, everyone's very clear about that. As a result of that incident, what happened then was there's a riot in the community the next day. One guy shot dead by the RSF and 7 others are shot and wounded, and there's outrage. But meantime, for Rahaf's family, the nightmare doesn't end there. Over the next few months, a gang of 3 RSF fighters, and she doesn't know if it's the same guys or not, twice come into the house in daylight, rob the family. The second time they grab her daughter again by the arm. There's all screaming and shouting, and the neighbors come in and the RSF kind of slink away. Anyway, finally, Rahaf gets her kids, including her daughter, out and all the way around into Omdurman, where they're living now in an improvised former school. And as she told me, she said, you know, one day this is going to end. I'm trying to support my daughter as best I can, but ultimately when this ends, people want to go home, but we don't want to go home because of the nightmare of what happened there, because the memories. She's saying, you know, I'm my daughter's kind of best friend and main support, and I've got to help her through this. And I keep telling her, it was not a disgrace. It was not a dishonor. It was fate. You were asleep in your own house. It just happened. It was an incident.
It's such a horrific story.
And very common story.
Anthony, has there been any attempt by the international community to intervene in this battle between 2 generals?
Yes, many attempts. So first of all, to go back, let's talk about something that's happened recently. I mean, in November last year, there was a British and Sierra Leonean backdraft at the UN Security Council to vote on a resolution for a ceasefire in Sudan. You might have thought that'd be a great idea, but no, Russia vetoed it. So no ceasefire. They couldn't even get that resolution through. That's indicative partially of the world we live in today. It's very, very divided. The UN Security Council, permanently divided, very difficult to get even the most basic vote through. However, there's multiple peace initiatives going on. Each side, the RSF and the SAF, know how to play the backers of different initiatives off to suit their own ends. So you're not actually getting very far with peace initiatives at the moment. But also, each of the 2 principal protagonists believes at the moment in a military solution. It's not a stalemate, this war. It's quite dynamic. It's going ding-dong one way or the other. And each side believes that with the finances they've been able to acquire, the way they're getting weapons pumped in from regional backers, that they can win the war. So there's not a huge amount of appetite for peace talks anyway. The war is in full flux.
And Anthony, you mentioned there that both the generals have no interest in giving up the battle yet because they have so much support from regional players. Just describe the teams effectively. Who's on which side?
Okay, there are some players play both sides, may I add, but basically you've got the Sudanese armed forces. These are commanded by General al-Burhan. Their backers include Egypt and Russia and Iran, principally. Then you've got the Rapid Support Forces commanded by Hemeti. Their principal backers include the United Arab Emirates, Chad, and then the regional countries allowing either the passage of fighters in to join the RSF, South Sudan, Central African Republic, Chad, or gold out. Sudan's got huge gold resources. Gold is one of the, principally funding the war for both sides, may I add. And so gold is going out, fighters are going in, and then you've got the regional backers, and each, with the different interests.
And Anthony, this will sound horribly simplistic. You've covered wars everywhere. They never fit a totally neat pattern. But is there such a thing as a good side in this battle?
Well, when I spoke to the American Special Envoy to Sudan, Tom Perriello, a couple of weeks ago, it was just before Christmas, I just got back from Sudan. He said to me there is, a bad side and an even worse side, suggesting that there is no good side. May I add that wars involve killing people, shooting people, depriving people of their homes, of their security. Once the shooting starts, you're not really talking about angels anywhere, right? But it's also fair to mention that the United States has just sanctioned the RSF and its leader, Hemeti, and 50 shell companies based largely in the UAE on account of purported genocide in Sudan. So genocide's a big word. So when we talk about, well, it's kind of, they're all as bad as each other. Well, not really, because it seems that one side is conducting a campaign of genocide.
Which is horrific. So, Anthony, that's quite clear. There's genocide being committed by one side. There are no brilliant sides in any of this. You've painted a broad sort of strategic picture of where that war is at the moment. How does this war end?
I don't see anything to stop it at the moment. Given the overall state of the world, and I'm not saying that glibly, I'm saying that because the mechanisms of conflict prevention or the imposition of ceasefires and such, particularly the UN Security Council, are broken at the moment, it would seem. And particularly, both sides are very far away, both the main protagonists in that war, from a point of exhaustion or tiredness at which they would like to talk. They would like a ceasefire. They would like peace. That's not what they want at the moment. Both sides, far from being tired, seem confident that they can win the war. It's very difficult, even with a worst-case scenario of millions dead, of starvation in a famine that, rivals the 1984 famine in the Horn of Africa, to see how that will be prevented at the moment. As it looks now, wars always end finally, but how many people must die before this ends?
And given the scale of the suffering, given that there are 150,000 already dead, potentially going into the millions pretty soon, there are horrific war crimes being committed, the rates that you described. Why is this such a forgotten war?
I think for different reasons. Practically, it's complicated for a journalist to get into the centre of Sudan, to get to Omdurman, to get to North Khartoum, to get in some of the areas of the south, and, is complex. It's complex to try and get the right permissions. It's very easy to come astray if you take a wrong turn out in the wilderness. So it's actually a complicated and difficult place to report from. But overall, people are very fixated on the wars in Ukraine and the situation in the Middle East, particularly Gaza and more recently Syria. People's consciousness, particularly with Ukraine, is very focused because they interpret it as an existential threat. And there's also, for Western and European societies, there is probably a cultural prejudice in focusing on stories involving Europeans, involving white Europeans, and involving a very, in Ukraine's case, easily definitive good side and bad side. In Sudan, that's very different. You've got a bad side and a much, much worse side. So people are confronted with a quite opaque conflict that they don't necessarily engage with. It appears more complicated for them to understand, and with those factors in mind, Sudan has become slightly a kind of stepchild to the misfortune of others.
That was Anthony Loyd, special correspondent for The Times. You can read his reports from Sudan at thetimes.com, and we've put a link in the description of this episode for a short film he made while he was out there. The producer today was Edward Drummond, the executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. If you can, please do leave us a review. It'll help others to find this episode and hear about a subject that isn't talked about anywhere near enough. Thanks for listening. I know it wasn't easy. See you tomorrow.